everybody. Everybody's excited to see you. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. We're going to go on and get started. In the words of the late Dr. Martin Luther King, everybody can be great because anybody can serve. Today we're joined by a great organization whose service is empowering communities and changing lives. To Marc Morial, the distinguished National Urban League guest, our distinguished Northwest Arkansas guest, and last but not least, our Tyson team, welcome to our Diversity Education Speaker Series in honor of Black History Month. Welcome. I invite each of you to savor this experience as we hear from one of the most influential civil rights leaders of our generation. At this time, I'll turn it over to Donnie Smith, our CEO, and we'll get started.
Awesome. Well, let me, too, extend my welcome. Thanks for joining us today. Today's going to be an exciting day. I have a great privilege that I get to introduce a man who is a lawyer, a professor, a former legislator, former mayor of New Orleans, during, by the way, what we might call the resurgence of New Orleans. He is, as Yolanda said, probably the most recognized civil rights leader in our country today, or certainly one of the most well known. And I get to say this: he's my friend, Marc. It is great to have you here today. So, as president of the National Urban League since 2003. He's been the primary catalyst for an era of change in that organization that's now nearly 100 years old. His energetic, skilled, and might I add to those of us here, his servant leadership style has expanded the League's work around an empowerment agenda which is redefining civil rights in the 21st century. I first met Marc in Mississippi, and I'm going to tell you, it was a memorable day. Number one, because we were both about to melt. It had to be 110 in the shade. But I don't just remember that hot day in Mississippi because there's always a hot day in Mississippi. But I got to really spend some time with Marc and got to learn a lot about what he's really about as an individual and what he cares deeply about and what he has made his life pursuit about. And that made a really big impression on me. Since then, we've expanded our role in our partnership with the Urban League, and now my old stomping grounds, Middle Tennessee, go Vols! And it has proven to be a wonderful partnership for our two organizations. There's so much in common, and I've just got to say this: I have never seen any group that can activate a community like the National Urban League. You guys are in a league of your own, and when we get together on issues that are important to us, like nutrition and hunger and those kinds of things, and we talk too about employment opportunities in urban areas and what we can do more there together. And by the way, the conversation that will happen a little bit later today, or maybe has already happened, about potentially establishing a urban league here in our region. I mean, those are just great great ways that we're so much alike, our two organizations. And it is just a privilege and an honor to have Marc with us today. And I want us all to pay very careful attention to a man that's making a huge difference in our organization, that's making a huge difference in our country. So, Marc, if you would, you come up and share with us, okay?
First of all, greetings. Good afternoon. Go Tigers. They'll run me out of town. Let me first of all express my appreciation to Donnie for his great leadership and for the way in which he's welcomed the expansion and strengthening of the relationship between Tyson and the National Urban League. Thank you so much, Donnie. And let all of you all know, Donnie made an encore performance down at the Urban League Conference last year. He was actually auditioning for the Jimmy Fallon show because he was our featured corporate CEO in what we do, luncheon of about 1,000 people. And Donnie was interviewed by T.J. Holmes and charmed everybody. Told some great stories, but also imparted some wisdom and talked about the substantive issues of hunger and the challenges we face as a nation. So, Donnie, thank you so very much for being with us last year, and also thank you for today and also for your team. I thought about what I would share with you all today because this is billed as a Black History Month presentation. And let me just begin by saying a word about that, because people oftentimes wonder, what's the genesis of the celebration of Black History Month? And, in our nation, we celebrate Black History Month. There's Women's History Month. There's now Hispanic Heritage Month. There are all sorts of times of the year where we dedicate to focusing on the contributions of important parts of our community. And Black History Month was the idea of a scholar by the name of Carter G. Woodson. And Carter G. Woodson was an author, a scholar, and a writer who in the teens and in the 20s actually created the idea of Black history, or in the terms of those times, Negro History Week. And he chose the week of the birthday of Abraham Lincoln and George Washington to celebrate or set aside as a scholar and as an author. Carter G. Woodson was concerned that the positive contributions of people of color were not part of America's mainstream history books. And he wanted to elevate that. And his idea was, if we set aside a week and now a month to elevate those contributions, it would help not just Black Americans, but all Americans understand to a greater extent that contributions to the history of the nation have been made by so many groups, so many parts of the community. So that was the genesis of Black History Month and the genesis of Black History Week as we recognize it. And I think it's as relevant as ever. And the reason why it's as relevant as ever is because we are 21st century Americans. We are 21st century leaders in America because we hold positions of enormous responsibility. Each and every one of you does. You are a part, if you work for Tyson, of an important enterprise that has as its business mission bringing food to the tables of Americans, healthy, tasty. I just had some for lunch, too. Healthy and tasty food to the tables of Americans and people all over the globe. If you work with the Urban League, our mission is to empower disadvantaged urban residents to achieve the social and economic mainstream in America. We're 21st century Americans, 21st century Americans. And we are living in a time of tremendous transformation and change and transformation that is moving faster and more dramatic than we can even imagine. Just think, ladies and gentlemen, think for one small minute that this is 2014. So we're 14 years in already to the 21st century. And think about the fall of 1999. How many of you can remember the fall of 1999? We were preparing for the advent of the new millennium. And there was a crisis afoot in America. It was called Y2K. You all remember that crisis? I was leading the city of New Orleans at the time, and all these experts said, you've got to hire all these other experts to make sure that all your systems don't crash at midnight on December 31st, 1999. And I'm still trying to figure out what all those experts got paid to do. Because nothing ever crashed. I guess they did their job. But that was the fall of 1999, and that was an American obsession. At that time, we had 4% unemployment. At that time, we had negligible inflation. At that time, but for the involvement of our military in the Balkans and in the old Yugoslavia, we were relatively a nation and a world at peace. There were conflicts and challenges, no doubt. That was 1999. Now you ratchet forward all the way to now, to 2014, and just reflect back to all of the dramatic, sometimes in many ways tragic events that have taken place in that 14-year period. 9/11 and a terrorist attack on the United States, costing the nation the lives of 3,000 people and changing the reality. If you're a traveler, you know it all the time. Shoes off, belt off, socks off, hat off, glasses off. Changed the way we live. But on a more dramatic front, 9/11 and the nation remains at war in two venues. In Iraq and Afghanistan. And that's just the beginning of that period after 9/11 and in the early days of the 21st century. And then we had Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. Of course, as a beloved son of New Orleans, that tragedy and the way in which it was dealt with in the immediate aftermath brought incompetence to a high level. But what's forgotten, 2,000 people lost their lives, and over 1 million people were temporarily and some permanently displaced. And that's 2005. So in just the period 2000 to 2005, we witnessed events that will be the subject of the analysis by historians and authors and people for literally hundreds or thousands of years. And that would have been enough to make the first decade of the 20th century a transformative, historic, and memorable decade. But then we had the mortgage meltdown, the Great Recession, the bank crisis, the economic crisis. We had some of the mightiest and most powerful financial institutions ever created, giant banks, teetering and tottering on the brink of failure, and the taxpayers having to come in on their white horse and save the day. And then a recession which cost millions of people their jobs, and a foreclosure crisis which cost millions of people their homes. This is all within this last 14-year period. And then, of course, you had an oil spill in the Gulf, and you've had the effort to return the nation to economic normalcy and stability, and a country still battling and fighting to right itself completely and fully after the economic recession. We are living, and we have lived through, and we've been front seat witnesses to dramatic history in our times. The 21st century, in just 14 years of this century, all of that is what we have seen. All of that is what we have witnessed. And I'm going to come back to why you hold these thoughts, what these 14 years mean to our generation as leaders and as citizens. But I want to go back, because I think you have to go back, and I think we as Americans, in our fast-moving obsession with the news cycle, anxiety about the here and now, don't give enough just due to the transformative events which took place in the 20th century. The world we live in, the nation we live in, the communities we live in, the way in which we live was dramatically reshaped by the events of the 20th century. That's the generation of your and my parents, the generation of your and my grandparents. How was it reshaped? It was reshaped by this industrial revolution which took place, which was a technological revolution. Electricity, internal combustion engines, automobiles, airplanes, televisions, dishwashers, microwave ovens, heated and cooled homes and commercial structures. That didn't exist in 1880. But by the time you got to 1940 or 50, it was virtually a given. A technological revolution. People say that the internet is a great technological innovation, which it is. But if you lived in Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, you would have thought air conditioning was the most important. And if you lived in Wisconsin or Minnesota or Chicago, you'd have thought heat. Dramatic technological change was brought about in the 20th century. In many respects, because of technology, the way in which people live changed more in 50 to 100 years than it had changed in the prior 1,000 years. And then there were the great conflicts. World War II. The United States in World War II defeated two powers in less than 5 years. Two powers, Japan and Germany. And in defeating Germany, we put down one of the most heinous, hateful, and repressive leaders in the history of humankind, who had a simple notion: I dominate and you subjugate. And then, right here on the soil of the United States, there was the conflict around racial justice and civil rights, which took on a character of nonviolent, peaceful protests, actions through the courts in the 1950s and the 1960s that ended what I like to call the American system of apartheid, and dramatically changed this nation in ways that would have been unimaginable just 20 or 30 years prior to that time. That conflict and that work and that battle and that effort also helped to promote, and side by side in this century of the 20th century, the dramatic transformation of the role of women in American life. 100 years ago, if we were in 1914, women did not have the right to vote in the United States. And activists in that time were pushing a constitutional change, which eventually took place to give women the right to vote. The 20th century. What's the context around these important efforts in the 20th century? You got to tip your hat to the men and the women and the generations that accomplished all of that. Whether they were frontline civil rights workers, presidents like Lyndon B. Johnson or Franklin Roosevelt, whether it was soldiers and generals like Dwight Eisenhower, whether it was inventors and industrialists whose names some we know and some we do not know, whether it was the people whose names we know, or all of the unsung heroes and heroines who were supportive of and part of all those efforts, it was a dramatic century. Across the globe, it's the century that we saw colonialism get crushed in Africa, military dictatorships get destroyed in Latin America, apartheid go down in South Africa, the Berlin Wall fall to pieces in Eastern Europe. That's the century of our parents and our grandparents. And essential to that century was the nation confronting its own challenges when it came to the difficult issues of race, the recognition, the struggle that took place, but the success against that struggle. With leaders who I always like to underscore and emphasize were Southerners. Martin Luther King was a Southerner. Lyndon B. Johnson was a Southerner. And they had grown up in different parts and different traditions of the South. But they risked reputation in different ways. Reputation and future. And less than, of course, 10 years after that dramatic accomplishment, they were both dead and gone. Martin Luther King to an assassin's bullet, and a 64-year-old Lyndon Johnson, just a poor health and probably a sense of disappointment that his accomplishments had not been fully recognized because of the complications of the Vietnam War. So I come forward to the here and now. And I come forward to the here and now by helping us remember and understand the 20th century. Because the challenges we face today, I have a hard time believing they're more difficult than the challenges of the 20th century. I have a difficult time thinking that somehow, some way, the challenges we face, whether it's the economy or schools or the need for better health, is not within our innate ability to confront. We have a more educated nation. We have a more prosperous nation when it comes to money and resources. We have technological advances and tools and techniques at our fingertips that even George Jetson could not have imagined. I saw Batman the other day. Batman had his scanner, man. We have all of this at our collective disposal. Yet this generation, our generation, I question whether we have the will. I question whether we've fallen in love with our own divisions. I question whether we understand the risk of not confronting today's problems. I question whether we have character and courage and a willingness to collectively sacrifice a little. Or have we become the generation that's in love with me? Love with I. Passionate about my. And no real sense of the broad collective and the challenges we face. A prosperous nation should not rest for 1 minute until every child in that nation, at the very least, finishes high school. And when they finish, they can read, write, count, and speak. A prosperous nation should work every day to maximize employment opportunities for all, so that anyone that's got to get up and go and desire has an opportunity to work. Not make work, not give away, but opportunity. A prosperous nation should not be content if only a few people do really, really, really well. I want to be like them, yeah. And the vast, vast majority are just scuffling and struggling just to pay basic bills. A prosperous and great nation and a generation which just happens to be in a role of leadership in that prosperous and great nation has to have an eye on tomorrow, an eye on the next 10, 15, 20 years. Martin Luther King, seminal figure in American history. You read his words, and there was so much eloquence in his words. But what struck me in his most famous words is that he talked about a vision for his children. He didn't talk about a vision for himself. He didn't appeal to people's sense that things would get better immediately for them, but that it was the next generation. Inherent in that was being selfless. Inherent in that was an appeal to the values of selflessness. So when we think about Black History Month, I'm urging and encouraging this broader context that the contributions and the role of African Americans has been indispensably linked to the progress that the nation has made in so many ways. But also, it's an appeal and a challenge and a word for you to consider or a thought for you to consider, and that is what we in our generation will, shall, and must do, because we do not want to be the generation that hands the baton to our children, and we're like 5 steps behind where it was given to us, or just 3 steps ahead to where it was given for us. That's our challenge. That's our charge, because we have a world, notwithstanding the difficulties and the challenges that exist in this country today, which are not inconsiderable. We live in a world that was strengthened and in a nation that was bettered, and in an America that was advanced by the efforts in the 20th century. And it's our challenge and our charge to confront what that means in the 21st century. So I encourage you to think about that and to recognize that in this mighty, great nation, it is important for people to celebrate the contributions of African Americans. But it's important for people to celebrate the contributions of Irish Americans and Italian Americans and German Americans and Asian Americans. This nation was shaped and formed by a set of forces, complex and unique. And peoples, with the exception of the American Indian, are people here whose roots go to other continents, to other cultures, to world beyond. And celebrating yourself should empower you to respect and celebrate someone else. Because that's the beauty. America's on a journey. A multicultural, pluralistic, democratic, economically competitive society hasn't existed in humankind. That's a journey. That's a vision. Whether those fellas that sat down in Philadelphia and wrote up all those papers, Declaration of Independence, and they came back and did the Constitution. Maybe they didn't have the complete vision in hand, but I think that in their highest level of thinking, that's where they want this nation to go. So let me thank you all for having me. Thank you for lunch. Thank you, Donnie. Thank you so much, and I think we're going to have a conversation. God bless you. God keep you. Are we going to do questions? So we'll do some Q&A or some opinion checking or fact checking or whatever you want to. Yeah. Anyone? We love questions. We love opinions. We love suggestions, recommendations. Tony.
About this annually, you talked about this earlier, about the fact that you all will be once again sharing your State of Black America. And while I know that the official word of that work will not come out till April, I was wondering if maybe, just maybe, you might be able to just give us a little tidbit, share a little bit about, what will be coming out this year.
Interestingly, so any of you all statisticians or deal with numbers, or anybody in here deal with numbers? Some people deal with numbers and stats and numbers. So, when I joined the league 10 years ago, this vexing question of race and the status of people in this country, people have all kinds of opinions, right? And some people say things are horrible. Some people say things are great. Some people say we've solved all the problems. Other people say we haven't. Some people say, well, it's worse than it's been. Some people say it's better than it's been. Some people say, well, you shouldn't talk about it. Some people say you should talk about it all the time. You get a lot of opinions, right, about the issue of race and racial status. So we decided 10 years ago, because we did a public opinion poll and found out what people thought and what their perceptions are. And what came out of that is, let's create an index that actually looks at hard numbers. So we created an index. It's called the Equality Index. And we look at 300 data sets grouped into 5 categories: economics, education, health, social justice, and civic engagement. And we hired the old Wharton econometrics forecasting firm to work with us. And we spent about 6 months building an index that we release every year. So the way the index works is that whatever the number for the status of whites is, it correlates with the number 1 on the scale. And for African Americans, and then we have a Hispanic index, it's either less than 1 or more than 1, depending on the correlation. And we took all 300 data sets, put them into a formula where we weighted some things, but it's not a heavy weighting. And that index forms the analysis, the statistical analysis that we'll release. So that number in the last 10 years has sort of gravitated between 70, 71%, and 73, 74%. So African Americans having the status of 73 to 74% when it comes to these statistical areas than white Americans. Interestingly, the Latino index is almost about the same, maybe a point higher, and so it has given us this idea that we want to encourage the nation when we talk about an issue like race and racial disparities, which is not always the most comfortable thing for people to talk about, to have it fact-based versus just opinion-based. Opinions are important. People should have an opinion, but we ought to also understand what the facts are. So you've got, last year we went back and we looked at the numbers, compared 1963 to 2013. And we found, for example, the poverty rate in the country has come down for blacks and whites, but has gone up since 2003 and 4 for both blacks and whites. But African Americans have a poverty rate 2.5 times as high as white Americans, for example. But there are more white Americans in the aggregate in poverty than there are black Americans. So these numbers, and so when we release the numbers, I think that numbers going to be in that spot. What we're going to focus a lot on this year is this growing problem of underemployment. That you may see it. Donnie and I were just talking. You begin to see things like unemployment when you look at consumer spending patterns, particularly when you look at consumer spending patterns on necessities. Because people, my best example is the grocery cashier I ran into about 6 months ago. And she overheard me having a conversation about jobs, and the lady says, she looks at me, she says, are you in the helping people find a job business? I said, what's up? She said, well, you see what I'm doing. I'm glad to be here, but I'm a school teacher. And I was 25 years of school teaching. I want to teach school. And I'll do this, but, I'm not making as much money. I'm really having a hard time. But I'm here, and I'll take double shifts if I have to. That's an example of underemployment, and there are lots of examples of people like that. It's people who had great careers. They're in their early 50s. They're laid off. And then they've got to go find anything to bring in some money. They're not old enough to collect any retirement if they have any, not old enough to collect any Social Security, to take advantage, and in some cases are still taking care of and raising a family, responsible for parents. We're going to put a focus on the underemployment problem as well as the unemployment problem, because I think underemployment is a new growing reality in this country, and it is a problem tough for all groups of Americans, but especially tough for African Americans. Questions? Questions, comments? Anybody, anything? It's 12:47 and 57, 8, 9, 12:48. Any other questions or comments? Yeah. Go ahead, Esther.
There's a school of thought that there's a war on the African-American male, regardless of where he resides on the socioeconomic scale. What's your perspective on that?
I tell you what my perspective is. I mean, we've had 2 big criminal cases where African-American males, teenagers, found themselves victims of gun violence where the perpetrators were not convicted. Right? The Zimmerman, Trayvon Martin, and now the case with Dunn and this other young man. And it's a tragedy. In the most recent case, I think 9 or 10 people voted to convict, and 2 or 3 voted to acquit in the jury. I think that African-American males, men and boys in this country, still face issues of perception, negative stereotypes all too often, and now find themselves, by and large, as one of the most locked out and left out groups of Americans when it comes to employment, incarceration rates, and education levels. But what I know is that, on the other hand, there's a Barack Obama. On the other hand, there's a Tony Waller. On the other hand, there are all these highly successful. So sometimes I'm almost puzzled in my own head as to how this reality is so stark and so difficult in this nation. On Thursday, the president is going to announce an initiative at the White House to confront and dedicate some, don't know what the initiative is going to include, boys and men of color. It's called My Brother's Keeper. And I'm looking forward, I'm going to be at that announcement and very eager to see what is involved. Why is this something that everyone should absolutely be concerned about? Because of all of the implications, negative implications that occur when you have a disproportionate number of black men who are unemployed, underemployed, and incarcerated. What it means for their children, what it means for society, what it means for themselves. And it is, I always, everyone sort of looks at themselves, you can become introspective about these issues. And at this age, I've become introspective about these issues because in my life, particularly when I go back to New Orleans, I run into so many people that I've known for a long, long time. And sometimes I am deeply puzzled when I see a grown man who clearly has had it very, very difficult, very, very tough, been in and out of jail, been on and off of drugs. And then I know that his own brother that grew up in the same house as he did is one of the most successful contractors in town. And I know the mother and the father both now passed and how they were raised. And I ask myself, how does this occur? How does this happen? This person grew up with the same as his brother. And up until they were probably 17 or 18, they were both decent, good students together. We have to deal with this issue. It's uncomfortable. I'm glad the president is going to deal with it on Thursday, but I know I'm bracing myself for commentators who are going to mock it and criticize it, who are going to try to use it as another divisive issue. Why are we doing this? Well, if you've got 40% of your country's prison population are African American men, and African American men make up about 7% of the overall population of the country, you got a statistical aberration. When the unemployment rate among young African American men is at 40 to 50%, you've got a statistical aberration and a real problem. The numbers and the situation cries out for a response. No one has a magic bullet or a magic pill, but it is a problem in this nation, and it's a problem that I think is going to get some added attention come Thursday. Anything else? Yes, all the way. Very good question. So one area where there's been marked improvement is in the area of civic engagement, which measures things like voting participation. The gap in that area has narrowed considerably, so we measure that. we saw before the recession the narrowing of health and educational gaps. Not significant, but enough to be measured. That progress has flattened itself a bit in the post, sort of as a recession has sort of matured, if you will, and as we've gotten. As to your question, I often ask myself, if the recession had not taken place, if we had had a continued growth economy, would the numbers have narrowed somewhat? And the possibility is perhaps. But you know, those of you that do know numbers, that one thing that changes the numbers is also the performance of the people at the highest levels. So if they go up to a greater extent, then the relative numbers may not move as much. What I'm hoping is that the economic numbers change and the education numbers change, because I think the two are correlated with each other. But what we have not seen is anything marked outside of civic engagement of change. And it's just a reminder that these types of things, these type of changes are glacial sometimes in their pace. And we should not, and let me give you one interesting number which shows why home ownership, right? How many of you all own your own homes? So that's about most people in here. So in the United States, about 70% of white Americans own their own homes. Just before the recession began, we were at a record level amongst African Americans. It was 50%. That number's now gone down to about 44%. So what's happened in a 5-year period on home ownership alone is that 20 to 25 years of gains were completely wiped out. So it took about 20 to 25 years for the numbers to go, about 20 years, 6, 7, maybe 8%, somewhere in that range. So that's why on an index, you could get changes for the good and changes for the bad, and the index doesn't necessarily change. But that index, if you're interested more, it's available online. It'll be available online, the 2014 version. You can get the 13 version online. And you all may find some numbers in the health area, in the education area that might be of interest, because we have comparisons in 300 data sets. There was another question back here. If there are no other questions, let me say thank you to Tyson, and let me thank Tyson for his partnership with the National Urban League. Donnie, again, thank you to you and your team. Appreciate your attention, and follow us. Who follows people on Twitter? At Marc Morial. You got a Twitter? At Tyson's? At Tyson. At Tyson Foods. So we'll follow you. You follow us.
Thank you, Marc. Let's give him a hand. We appreciate the challenge that you've given to us to be more selfless and to leave our generation better for the next generation. So on behalf of the Tyson Foods family, we have a small token of appreciation. We would like to present you with your very own Tyson khaki shirt. So you are officially a part of the Tyson family. So we want to thank you for your commitment to community, your servant leadership, and your passion for making a difference in the lives of others. Thank you.
Couldn't take it anyway. There may be lawyers in the room.
So, Donnie, what I have here is, this is a
Oh, come on now. That is awesome.
So that concludes our program. Marc will stick around for pictures. If you want to come down and meet him personally, he'll be around for a few minutes. Thank you for attending. Have a good day.